Hello, I'm Meia Nouwens, IISS Senior Fellow for Chinese Security and Defense Policy and host of the IISS Sound Strategic Podcast. In today's episode, we'll discuss the ongoing developments in the Middle East, from the status of the war in Gaza to the broadening of Israel's operations in the region. We'll talk about what Israel's ground operation in Lebanon and Iran's missile attack on Israel mean for the prospect of a regional or regionalized war in the Middle East. In the run-up to the U.S. elections and balancing efforts by Gulf states, we'll also question how this conflict may develop in the near term. Joining me today are three colleagues from the IISS's offices in London, Berlin, and Manama. Emile Hokayem, Director of Regional Security and Senior Fellow for Middle East Security, Hasan Alhasan, Senior Fellow for Middle East Policy, and Fabian Hinz, Research Fellow for Defense and Military Analysis. Emile, Hasan, and Fabian, welcome onto the show. Emile, starting with you. 1 year after the October 7th attack on Israel, are we facing the start of a regionalized war in the Middle East?
Definitely a year into this war in the Middle East, it has taken on a new dimension with the growing Israeli campaign in Lebanon and the possibility of a ground invasion there. Direct confrontation between Iran and Israel, first in April of this year, and now again in September, October of this year. We see that the conflict is morphing in very dangerous ways, sucking in a lot of regional and, importantly, international actors. In a way, the worst case scenario that was envisioned in October, a war that metastasizes and then is happening. I mean, it hasn't gone all the way. The capabilities of Iran and its partners are more limited, or at least have been eroded, and their risk profile is such that they've been on the back foot. So it hasn't been yet this cataclysmic war. But if you were the US administration a year ago and said, what do you want to avoid? It's exactly what's happening right at present. It may end up working for them if Israel's retaliation after the attacks of last night, the large-scale Iranian missile attack on Israel, but we're still in a high-risk zone. Importantly, I would say all this pushes away the attention from the still very violent and very bloody war in Gaza. Right, so the more it becomes regional, the less attention is paid to Gaza, to a ceasefire there, to Israeli hostages there, to humanitarian issues, and so on. So as this war grows in regional scope and intensity, and as it starts involving state actors, what started it all fades away from the international agenda.
What is Israel's strategy here?
I think Israel, after a bumpy start, is making the most out of its air superiority, intelligence superiority, and its escalation dominance. It's not necessarily after coercive diplomacy, i.e., creating an advantage and then saying we will settle on these terms. I think that in a number of places, Israel is after the destruction, or at the very least, the debilitating of its enemies. They still have the momentum. They're the ones setting the tone, the tempo. They're the one deciding which front ignites when. From an operational perspective, they're having quite a lot of success. The problem is that there is no political strategy. There seems to be no desire to articulate a sustainable political endgame. But then the question is, are these never-ending wars that need to be sustained over time? If so, can Israel sustain that? But also, importantly, can the other side sustain it? To be more specific, when it comes to Lebanon, the several hits of the past 2 weeks against Hezbollah have essentially decapitated the leadership, not the movement itself. The movement is resilient, but it no longer exists as this mighty, powerful force that we assessed it existed only a year ago. But for Israel, I think the goal is clear. They want to declaw Hezbollah as an organization. And in the process, if that means doing to southern Lebanon what Israel did in Gaza, which is turn the place into an unlivable space, then be it. And without an articulation of political objectives. The US is trying to add a diplomatic political layer to all that. The US has been impotent all along, struggling to reach a ceasefire in Gaza, struggling to contain the conflict in Lebanon, struggling to, importantly here, to deter Iran, which has fired missiles at Israel twice now. It is quite telling at present that essentially the US is on board with the Israeli strategy because they don't have any influence to shape Israeli action at present.
Let's talk about Lebanon for just a second more. We now see, of course, an Israeli ground operation in Lebanon. What do you think this means for Lebanon more widely in terms of humanitarian, economic, or domestic political repercussions?
So that war happens at the worst possible time. Lebanon was already on its knees economically, politically. Its military is exhausted. The soldiers are underpaid. The population, the society is divided. So that conflict is a massive additional burden on structures that cannot really take it. Now, much will depend on what Israel does. At the moment, contrary to 2006, Israel is or appears to be primarily focused on military targets, stockpiles, Hezbollah leadership, and so on. Israel has not yet started to hit critical infrastructure, bridges, roads, electrical plants, water plants, fuel storage tanks, as it did in 2006. But that's because Israel is fighting the war it has wanted to fight since the 2006 war. So the Lebanese are watching all that and wondering, okay, will there be a ground invasion? If so, how deep will that invasion go? And will that invasion turn into an occupation? These are the considerations on people's mind. Now, if it's an occupation at the end of that, regardless of how large the region is, it will, in a way, in retrospect, validate Hezbollah's ethos, the Mukawama ethos, that now you have an occupier, you have to resist, and don't think about the cost of the war or why it happened. It's the priority is to fight the occupier. But we're not there yet. I mean, the Israelis have, in a way, calibrated their ground operations at the moment, going in and out very quickly to dismantle Hezbollah's infrastructure close to the border, but it has mostly been an air campaign at present. So people are generally terrified. This is a country that already had around 1.5 million refugees on top of small population of 4.5 million. Since 2 weeks ago, you have an additional 1 million internally displaced people. That's almost 1/5 of the total population living there. It's a massive burden for a country that has no reserves, very few friends, no ability through its military and security services to keep the place together. It could be quite devastating for the country, but in a way, it's not unexpected. This could be the worst case scenario, but it's close to the worst case scenario that we had envisioned a year ago when all this started.
You've mentioned the air war. So, moving on to Fabian, Iran launched over 200 missiles at Israel on the 1st of October. How do you judge the air war between Israel and Hezbollah and other development that we've just seen in the last few days?
When you look at the air war, you can first look at the Israeli side. And of course, the Israelis have enjoyed complete air superiority over the adversaries. That's no big surprise. We always knew that Iran itself and these groups could not really challenge Israeli air power to a large extent. And the Israelis have made full use of it. They've made full use of it both for massive aerial campaigns that degrade the fighting power of Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. They have also made use of it for more calibrated strikes that are less aimed at degrading enemy military capabilities and more aimed at offering precise strikes as part of a tit-for-tat escalation without provoking a full-scale conflict. Of course, with Israel, that air superiority has given its major military advantages in terms of decreasing the exposure of their ground troops, but it has also, if you think about it, also given them massive disadvantages because the very liberal use of air power and the urban destruction and humanitarian suffering that it has caused in Gaza have had a real impact on the Israeli standing in the wider world. When you look at the Iranian axis of resistance, they've had the strategy of compensating for their lack of capable air forces through amassing UAVs and precision-guided missiles. And the idea would be that even if Israel has great defenses, they can overwhelm these. They can strike targets in the Israeli depth. That gives them leverage. That gives them an option in case of war that could deter Israeli attacks. And I would say to some extent, the strategy has worked in the past, but we're also seeing its limitations. When you're seeing a country like Israel that has defenses that work so exceptionally well, and especially when you see an actor like Israel that is willing to accept the risk and is not too sensitive to a few strikes getting through, your deterrent effect is really being degraded. And I think we're seeing that right now, where even an attack as massive as the one we saw yesterday is probably not going to change Israeli strategy on the grander scheme of things.
I mean, in that sense, can the Houthis or Iraqi militias, for example, actually pose a real threat to Israel?
When you look at other actors, the Houthis in Yemen, for example, they can strike Israel. They've launched attacks against Israel, and some of them have been lucky shots in quotation mark that got through. The Iraqi militias have launched continuous attacks using UAVs and cruise missiles. But then again, these actors are more on the weaker side of things. So the Houthis can launch a few missiles, but their chances of launching a major attack are slim. They just don't have the arsenal to cover that range. The Iraqi Shia militias are in a better geographic position, but still it's not that important. The real two power centers within the axis of resistance were Iran and Hezbollah. And of course, Iran still has its capabilities, but there are also questions of how deep their arsenals are. How many strikes like these yesterday and in April could they stage if they want to escalate further? But when you look at Hezbollah, as Emile has said, their leadership has been decapitated. A lot of their strategic capabilities seem to have been taken out in airstrikes. Israeli air superiority, in combination with a tremendous intelligence picture, has proven to be a major problem for Hezbollah. If they would want to launch massive attacks, the kind of attacks where you launch thousands of missiles a day, that would need coordination, especially when you're faced with Israeli air superiority. Can they still do that in the current situation? I have my doubts. The Hezbollah element of Iran's forward deterrence, so to say, has been substantially degraded. And of course, that's a problem to the extent where now logic has been reversed. Hezbollah is not protecting Iran in a way, it's Iran that needs to protect Hezbollah.
And is Iran's wider ring of fire strategy of the quote unquote resistance axis succeeding or failing in your view?
You could say that to some extent it's not working out as planned. The Iranians have not been able to deter major Israeli acts like the killing of Haniyeh in Tehran, the killing of Nasrallah, the killing of high-ranking IRGC personnel. So you could make the argument that it's failing. The question is, how are regime factions in Tehran seeing it? You could spin this in different directions. You could say we're not as capable as we thought we were, so we have to tone down our regional politics. You could say, actually, the strategy has been working. We just invested too little money into it. We have to do more of the same thing we've already been doing. Again, the people who built up these capabilities have powerful lobbies within the country. They have powerful industries built up. They've invested a lot of money. They're locked into this trajectory. But you could, of course, also say, the strategy has not proven as effective as we thought. Now we need to find a different way of deterring our adversaries, and nuclear could be part of it.
Thinking about how other countries might be viewing this, Emile, you already mentioned that the United States has been quite impotent in its response. How do you think Washington, D.C., and perhaps also capitals in Europe are going to be viewing these developments?
The US has shown that militarily and technologically it is very capable. It has come to the defense of Israel twice. It has a large military footprint. It has been diplomatically impotent in the sense that it has failed to shape Israel's military behavior and objectives, and it has failed to deter the other side. But the views from the regions have been ambivalent, I would say. People have looked at the US as a country that has no agency, but at the same time as the only player able to sit at the center of all these dynamics over the negotiation over ceasefire and hostage release, or negotiations over air defense in the region. And the US role is still very central. Now, the question is over the medium and long term, is the US standing so battered that countries in the region are going to double down on their strategic diversification strategies, i.e., looking for other security, economic partners, and so on? The US is so dominant globally that it's unlikely that we'll see a massive shift. The question then becomes, is the US so politically toxic because of the burden of Gaza? Is the US so tainted because of the perception of double standards over Ukraine and Palestine and so on, that it essentially remains a security player but has no real diplomatic reach anymore? All this will take some time to unfold. A lot will depend on who sits in the White House in a couple of months, because ultimately what matters most in the region are the wild swings in US policy. We may see a very different approach from a Harris presidency or a Trump presidency compared to what we see right now. People are bracing. There's quite a lot of unknowns out there.
Hasan, what about the positions of the Gulf states? How have these evolved since October last year?
There are very important elements of both continuity and change in the Gulf states' positions since the war broke out in October last year. And the main element of continuity, I think, is that the Gulf states see it as being in their core short term interests to remain above the fray. Keep in mind that Saudi Arabia is doing its best to exit a long war in Yemen, and all of the Gulf states are prioritizing economic development. And I think it's very clear to them that being sucked into another regional conflict would obviously be of disservice to their economic ambitions and their prosperity agendas. So I think the bottom line for the Gulf states is that they're, I think, doing everything they can not to be sucked into the conflict. And the way I think they do that is by taking primarily a defensive position. So intercepting Houthi missiles and UAVs when they cross into Saudi territory, for example, but avoiding sending any offensive signals to Iran and Iran's armed non state allies in the region. All of the Gulf states, with the exception of Bahrain, have stayed out of Operation Prosperity Guardian in the Red Sea. They have chosen not to participate in US and British strikes on the Houthis in Yemen. And there was even reporting that they had imposed some restrictions on the US's use of their territories and airspaces to launch attacks against Iran. The point here is that the Gulf states want to adopt a defensive posture. They're happy to remain as strategic partners with the United States to allow the United States to operate out of their soil, but without sending any offensive signals to Iran. I think one of the big lessons learned here for the Gulf states, and which informs and solidifies this position, is that on the one hand, you do have very clear American and Israeli intelligence and military superiority, but that at the same time, it's nearly impossible to deter Iran. These are obviously all regional players with a very large appetite for risk taking. And so the best strategy to adopt is neutrality and the attempt to maintain relations both with Israel and Iran. And I think this is a wider lesson learned for all of the Gulf states, including Bahrain, which has always traditionally been the most hawkish on Iran. And you've even seen Bahrain in the past few months make very public gestures and overtures in the aim of restoring relations with Tehran. The other point is that obviously the weakening of Hamas and Hezbollah is probably in the Gulf states' geostrategic interests. They don't look upon these groups very favorably. The issue, however, for the Gulf states is that instability in Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt very certainly isn't in their interest. And obviously, Israel's behavior has repercussions, whether it's in Gaza, in Lebanon, in the West Bank, obviously affects all of these countries that are, some of whom share borders with the Gulf states and are obviously very closely interconnected with the Gulf states in various diplomatic and economic forms. Now, the problem, I think, the main risks that the Gulf states face is that remaining neutral can also mean that there is a deficit of regional leadership. And that has a legitimacy eroding effects potentially for these Gulf states, which claim to be leaders of the Arab world and of the Islamic world, including Saudi Arabia. So keep in mind that for example, the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation took over a month to convene an extraordinary resolution late last year in response to the events in Gaza. And that obviously also generates domestic pressure because the perception of Gulf inaction can be quite frustrating for Gulf and Arab publics. Keep in mind that all of the Gulf publics and Arab publics are very much in solidarity with Palestine and Lebanon. There has been truly a generational awakening throughout the region where the Palestinian issue, which had all but been forgotten, has really become at the center stage of this generational awakening and this self-affirmation. I think in ways that are also, not very complementary to the way people in this part of the world view the United States and the collective West. That has prompted a degree of change as well since the war started in Gulf positions and Gulf policies. And so we've clearly seen the issue of Palestinian statehood become a more pivotal component of how the Gulf states are positioning themselves on this war. The Gulf states have expressed support for an international peacekeeping force in Gaza. They've expressed their willingness to engage in reconstruction so long as there isn't an Israeli occupation, a long-standing Israeli occupation of Gaza. So they don't want to be providing political cover for an Israeli occupation that's most certainly going to be rejected throughout the region. We've also seen the clearest expression from the Saudi Crown Prince himself, Mohammed bin Salman, in his address to the opening session of the Shura Council, which for a Western audience is the Saudi equivalent of the US's State of the Union address, in which he very clearly stated that Saudi Arabia would not be normalizing relations with Israel so long as there isn't irreversible, tangible progress towards a Palestinian state. Now, there are obviously challenges to this posture because you have a Palestinian Authority that's weak, corrupt, ineffective under the leadership of Mahmoud Abbas. The Gulf states have been very vocal in expressing their frustrations with the Palestinian Authority, but it remains the case that the issue of Palestinian statehood has become front and center for the Gulf states, especially for Saudi Arabia, which has very recently launched a global alliance for the implementation of a two-state solution. It sees itself as leading the diplomatic charge in formulating a clear vision and proposal and roadmap for what a Palestinian state should look like.
Before we move on to the role that Gulf states could play in potential reconstruction or providing political muscle in the region, can I just ask, building on what Fabian said, if Iran does escalate further in its strategy in the region, particularly towards Israel, of course, what would Gulf states' reaction be then?
I doubt we'd see much of a Gulf reaction unless their interests are directly affected. Iran has been careful to ensure that the Gulf states remain on the sideline. And so Iran has been on a diplomatic charm offensive vis a vis the Gulf states. It has clearly signaled that it wants better relations with its neighbors in the region. I think out of concern in Tehran that they don't want to be fighting everyone at the same time. And I think the Gulf states have reciprocated this. And in fact, we've seen the war somewhat accelerate the diplomatic rapprochement between Iran and the Gulf states. It served as the backdrop for clear steps towards a restoration of relations between Bahrain and Iran. The war was the occasion for the first direct phone call between the Saudi Crown Prince and the late Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi. And we've seen Gulf diplomats and senior statesmen flock to Tehran to offer condolences on, for example, the passing of the late Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi. And so, in a sense, ironically somewhat, even as the Gulf states have close relations with Israel, to some extent, at least some of them, the UAE most certainly, even though the Abraham Accords have remained in place, they have not been rolled back, relations between Bahrain, the UAE, and Israel remain intact. At the same time, the Gulf states have accelerated their diplomatic rapprochement, and this has been their way of staying above the fray, ensuring that they remain out of Iran's crosshairs, while at the same time preserving the strategic partnerships with the United States and increasingly with Israel that they see as being vital to their national security strategies.
Looking forward a little bit, what do you think the Gulf states would be interested in terms of potentially funding reconstruction? And if so, what numbers we're talking about? And second of all, providing that political leadership that you've mentioned is currently lacking.
Qatar, for example, has been very much involved and very much engaged and has played a leading role in seeking to broker a ceasefire in Gaza. And so Qatar has been somewhat of an exception insofar as it has been more involved than others, to the extent that its mediation efforts have led to a lot of frustration in Doha because of the various parties' unwillingness really to engage in genuine diplomatic talks. I think there is a broad willingness in the Gulf states to engage in the post conflict Gaza and the day after for Palestine more broadly once the dust settles. This allows them in the short term to say that they're actually involved and that they're making a positive and constructive effort to look after the interests of their Palestinian brothers and so on. In the long run, yes, I think the Gulf states will want to be involved as reconstruction and governance actors. The Gulf states have, and we've looked at this extensively in our work on Gulf bailout diplomacy, have been some of the most important sources of foreign aid, stabilization financing to the region. They have preferred to provide Palestine with humanitarian aid more so than directly supporting the Palestinian Authority because of widespread perceptions of corruption and ineffectiveness within the Palestinian Authority. And so I think before the Gulf states can play a real role in reconstruction, I think they will want to ensure that we have a reformed Palestinian Authority in place, that there is a clear path towards Palestinian statehood, that they're not serving as facilitators of an Israeli occupation. These elements will have to be in place, and that there is a clear and sustainable resolution to this situation in Gaza, because the endless cycle of violence, war, and destruction has, I think, deterred many would-be funders, including the Gulf states, but also others in Europe, from continuing to pump money into reconstruction, only to see all of that work being destroyed because of this recurrent cycle of violence and destruction. So I think the Gulf states do have a broad political willingness. There might be economic and fiscal challenges. If oil prices remain depressed for a considerable period of time, then that could place a constraint on the Gulf states' fiscal capacity to engage in widespread and large-scale reconstruction. The broad political willingness is there, so long as these elements on the absence of an Israeli occupation, on the clear path towards a Palestinian statehood, and a reformed Palestinian Authority are all in place.
Excellent. Well, that's all we have time for today. So thank you, Emile, Hasan, and Fabian, for sharing your insights. And thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. You can find more information on the topics discussed in today's episode in our show notes. Please do follow, rate, and subscribe to Sound Strategic wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts to keep up to date with the latest episodes. Thank you and see you next time.